Stealth games share many mechanics, from Splinter Cell and Hitman to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Players do their best to crouch, to make as little noise as possible, to disable opponents without being discovered, and keeping to the shadows and the gloom. But none of that would exist in the way we know it today without one groundbreaking video game series, one that looked at the initials FPS and decided that S didn't need to always stand for shooter. This series not only introduced many of the mechanics and UI elements we associate with stealth games today, but they hold up even to this day, 30 plus years after their creation and well past the closure of their development studios. Before we fought conspiracies with Sam Fisher, before we sneaked through air vents with any of the Denton boys, there was Garrett and his home, the city. So sit back and let me tell you everything you need to know about Thief. Thief was developed by Looking Glass Studios, a now legendary and defunct developer also responsible for the first ever immersive Sims, Ultima Underworld and System Shock. The initial concept, story, and world design of Thief were the work of Ken Levine, and if that name sounds familiar, he's the man behind BioShock. Initially, the game was to be an action RPG, drawing inspiration from Castle Wolfenstein and Diablo, and called Better Red Than Undead, set in the 1950s during the America-Russia Cold War, where you'd have to hack zombies to pieces with swords because bullets didn't work on the undead. This project was cancelled, as it was deemed too quirky to market, which makes me think it would be a good fit for the modern era if anyone wanted to revisit it. With Better Red cancelled, they kept the sword fighting concept and pivoted to a first-person combat simulator called Dark Camelot, featuring a steampunk corrupted Camelot with Arthur as the villain and Mordred as the hero. This concept would also never see the light of day because they couldn't quite get the sword fighting right. So Dark Camelot became The Dark Project, Mordred became Garrett, and Camelot itself became the city. Initially, the team didn't really know what kind of game they were going to make, until they very much stumbled onto the stealth and thievery gameplay, where you just try to stay hidden and grab as much as you can before heading out. Funnily enough, in Dark Camelot's days, lead programmer Marc LeBlanc had suggested the inclusion of stealth missions, but was shut down as it didn't match the action-oriented gameplay they were going for. Seems to me that history proved him right in the end. Thief's development was not a smooth ride. The studio faced numerous financial difficulties, an entire branch closed, half the team was fired, and Ken Levine left mid-development to form Irrational Games, which would then work with Looking Glass to develop System Shock 2, using an unfinished build of the Looking Glass proprietary engine, the Dark Engine, which was developed in tandem with the Dark Project, adding further complication to the game's creation. There were a slew of bugs and issues that simply made the Dark Project not a very fun game to play. The AI was a mess and had to be completely overhauled, and along the way many of the planned features had to be scrapped, including branching storylines and even multiplayer. So the team decided to focus exclusively on a linear story, single-player missions, and just good stealth gameplay, and renamed the game Thief: The Dark Project, which helps cement the game's thievery concept in everyone's mind. For the tabletop RPG players among you, you'll be interested to know they chose to add the thief at the beginning of the game title to make it more evocative and descriptive, following the example of tabletop RPG Vampire: The Masquerade. Despite all these issues, Thief would release on the 1st of December 1998 to critical acclaim, and in 1999 would be followed by Thief Gold, an expanded version of the game with new missions and enemies. You can think of it as the director's cut or the definitive version of Thief. In 1999, Looking Glass began development of Thief 2, a game that drew heavy inspiration from the 1931 German film M and the classic 1927 movie Metropolis. The anime movie Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, and the 1949 film noir classic The Third Man are also cited as inspiration. These movies influenced the city, the focus on machinery, automatons, and the evolution of the main character Garrett, who they intended to begin the game as a cynical thief, move on then to becoming more of a private detective, and end up more or less a James Bond kind of character. The game would also focus a lot more on urban stealth and human enemies, as some of the feedback from the Dark Project was that players did not enjoy the undead enemies nor the maze-like structure of some of the levels. So with the city being a bigger focus, its visual style was nailed down, inspired greatly by Victorian London, with hints of Gotham City as depicted in the 1989 Tim Burton Batman film, to give the game a bit more of that, and I quote, Batman feel. Thief 2: The Metal Age would release in March 2000, to once again critical acclaim, and is considered the best-selling title in the series. And I think this quote by one of the reviewers, Thomas L. McDonald, best sums up why Thief 2 did so well. Everything in Thief 2 is bigger, sharper, better, and more effective than its predecessor. Thief had always been planned as a trilogy, and development for the third entry had already begun by the time of Thief 2's release. Unfortunately, even with the success of the Metal Age, Looking Glass could not escape its financial troubles and would ultimately close down a few months after the release of the sequel. Publisher Eidos Interactive would acquire the Thief IP and hand over development to Ion Storm, who would release Thief Deadly Shadows in 2004, dropping the 3 from the title in fear of alienating anyone who hadn't played the previous entries. Unfortunately, much like Thief 2 was for Looking Glass, Deadly Shadows would prove to be the last game ever developed by Ion Storm, and the last the world would see of Thief until the 2014 revival by Eidos Montreal. The Thief games take place in the city, yes, simply the city, a vast steampunk medieval metropolis. The way people dress and behave is very medieval, but they have advanced technology. It's a dark place full of corrupt officials, thieves, cutthroats, and even the occasional undead. At the top of the city is the Baron, the ruler of the city and foremost of the nobles. His city watch and its leader, the sheriff, keep the peace when they're not lining their pocket. The city is also home to several factions locked in constant and ever-shifting conflict. The Order of the Hammer is a knightly order, in appearance very Templar-like. Its members, commonly dubbed the Hammerites, all carry hammers, which they consider a sacred implement of their deity, the Builder, a god of progress and innovation and order. At first glance, the Hammerites might seem just normal knights in a medieval setting, but they went much further. First, they were the law and order of the city before the City Watch, and even afterwards they ran some of the prisons. But that's not all. They were also construction contractors, ran factories, and developed much of the technology seen in the city. In direct opposition of the Hammerites are the pagans, worshippers of the nature deity the Trickster. The Master Builder's followers represent order, but the pagans are anarchists especially attuned to nature, the wild, beasts, and of course, chaos. You can consider them this world's eco-terrorists. Their focus is living in communion with nature at the expense of technological progress and the destruction of the environment. They despise the people living in the city, especially the Hammerites, and they themselves prefer to live in the wilderness. But given that the Woodsy Lord, as they call him, the Trickster, ultimately wishes everything to return to nature, well, the pagans often find themselves carrying out several ploys in the districts of the city. The last major organization, the Keepers, are the reclusive and highly secretive monastic order. They are hidden from plain view, and in fact, it's said that a keeper can only be seen if they wish for that to happen. Over the different titles, it's revealed they use glyphs for magical purposes, primarily secrecy and protection, and they keep a chronicle of the city, always watching, taking notice, keeping an eye on the signs of different prophecies, but never interfering. At least not directly, and not by their own hand. Enter Garrett, our protagonist. As a child, he pickpocketed a keeper, which impressed the monk, who took him under his wing and inducted him into the order. There he learned his craft, how to stay hidden, how to remain quiet, and how to erase any mark of his passing. Plus a little combat here, archery there, and of course a host of athletic abilities. Unfortunately, Garrett didn't take to the monastic life, to being hidden away. It's said that he carried too much anger in his heart, and so he left the Keepers and put his talents to use as a thief. And though he prefers to keep as far away from the Keepers as possible, as well as every other faction, he always ends up doing something for his former mentors or finds himself smack dab in some faction conflict. Not just Pagan versus Hammerite though, but also Hammerite versus Hammerite, as seen in Thief 2, where there is a schism in the order between the traditional Hammerites and the more industrial Mechanists. In Thief, the Dark Project, or Thief Gold as it's most commonly sold, Garrett is simply trying to make a living, but a series of mishaps and a brazen display of thievery bring him into the services of a pair, Victoria and Constantine, who have dark designs for the city as a whole. In the sequel, Thief 2: The Metal Age, Garrett is working against an extremist hammer splinter group, the Mechanists, who push technological progress to the limit and, let's just say, look down on organic life. All organic life. Then came Thief: Deadly Shadows, the final game in Garrett's adventures, and a title that focuses on the Keepers, this time unearthing their secrets and along the way saving the city from the skeletons in their closet. Now, you may be wondering, where does the Garrett from the reboot game fit into this? Is he another version of our old friend from Thief 1 to 3? No. In fact, while it's called a reboot, you can consider it a successor, a sequel set far in the future. It's a different Garrett altogether, but there are still traces of the original, artifacts and tales of the now legendary Sneak Thief, as they've come to call him. But we're not really focusing on that game in this video. That one deserves its own look. It's really its own thing. The Thief series is the father of the entire stealth genre. The things we take for granted today, real physics, keeping quiet, light and shadow, AI enemies reacting to environmental cues, and more were all introduced by Thief. And I'm not just mentioning them because it's part of the series and Looking Glass Studios' legacies, but because the version of these mechanics and systems, as they are in these 20-plus-year-old games, still hold up. Thief games are so detailed in their soundscape that even the tutorial mission in the Dark Project has you walking between carpets and flooring with different sound cues. Thief does stealth like very few other games. Sure, there are hiccups, but it's still a better stealth series than most modern titles. And just so you know how much Thief influenced the stealth genre, it introduced the concept of very powerful while unseen, but weak once discovered, which is prevalent in many titles in the genre. Garrett can take out enemies with his arrows or his trusty blackjack in one hit while stealthing, but once he's alerted the guards, they can be hardy to kill. The sword fighting is decent, it's a functional system with blocks and directional attacks, but the focus is definitely on staying out of sight, but that's easier said than done. Thief 1 and 2 are very much mission focused, each level telling the next part of the story, but while that is linear, you have complete freedom of approach in completing your objectives. There are often multiple points of entry, multiple exits, you have different tools at your disposal, and with the funds obtained from selling the stuff you stole, you can buy more gear. From more broadhead arrows for sniping enemies, to water and moss arrows to douse torches and cover noisy flooring. This is a magical technological setting. There are mines, fire arrows that act very much like a rocket launcher, and even invisibility and slow fall potions in Thief 2. Or if you want, you can go in with your blade in hand, present yourself to the guards and shout, "My name is Garrett, you killed my father, prepare to die," and then duel everyone. You'll likely fail the mission by virtue of exsanguination, but you're free to do so. Similarly, it's your choice whether to simply avoid enemies, blackjack them to knock them out, or take them out permanently. Not to mention there are different difficulty levels that add challenge and secondary objectives to the levels, in case you really want to test your thieving skills. Thief 3 also has missions, but in addition to that you can free roam through different sections of the city. The city itself was part of the previous two titles, but you were confined to the area of the particular level, while Deadly Shadows allows you to travel between the districts to get into all sorts of trouble and even build bridges with the different factions. You can get chummy with the Hammerites, or help the pagans do their thing. By this point in the tale, Garrett had enough positive and negative interactions with the factions that they'll be open to negotiations. You can even visit the Keepers and have a few uncomfortable conversations with Garrett's former mentors. It's my favorite part of the games and the Thief world. I love the city and its mix of steampunk, Victorian London, and magic and monsters. And I love the different factions and the mythos around them and how they interact with one another. Oh, I almost forgot. Thief 3 also has one of the scariest video game levels ever created, the Shalebridge Cradle, a haunted and actively malevolent building that started out as an orphanage and then also became an asylum. One of the designers, Randy Smith, developed theories of interactive horror design and put them all to the test in the design of the cradle. With the help of fellow designer Jordan Thomas, and its creepy soundscape came from the composer Eric Brocious. It's a level I think everyone should experience, especially with the lights off and wearing headphones. Much like with the stealth mechanics themselves, this creepy, horrible place still holds up. Cutscenes in Thief usually pop in between missions, particularly for the first two games, and they are a delight, looking as if they were drawn on paper by artist Daniel Thrawn, with assistance from Jennifer Rabota Lester for Thief Gold and The Metal Age. It's a very unique presentation. There are also some really cool cutscenes where live performers were rotoscoped, blending the line between FMV and those drawn scenes. And while the brunt of the storytelling happens in these cutscenes, Thief was made by the creators of the immersive sim genre. So of course, there is copious amount of visual storytelling and documents and files strewn throughout the missions that complement not only the plot, but also the world building. For example, in the first mission of Thief 2, you can find a little alcove that someone's hidden behind some crates, with an altar that could be mechanist or perhaps even pagan, given the nature around the area, showing you just how much influence the different religions have in the city. Garrett is very much a film noir, hard-boiled pulp detective character, a cynical thief, but ultimately one with a heart of gold. And he evolves through the three games, from selfish but loyal to his own, to a grudging hero, becoming a more selfless character in Thief 3, but never losing that pulp noir edge and charm. Thief, curiously, has two entry points into the series. The first, of course, Thief Gold. From there, heading into the sequels, The Metal Age and Deadly Shadows. The second entry point is, of course, Deadly Shadows. One of the reasons for not being called 3 was to avoid alienating a new audience, and with that intent is the fact that you can play this game on its own. But of course, playing its predecessors, especially using mods to bring them up to current PC standards, will give you a much greater understanding and appreciation for the world and characters of Thief. Then of course is the remake, reboot, and you can play that one without needing to play any of the previous 3. But as I said, that game is another thing altogether. Thief is one of the most influential video game series ever created. Its mechanics and concepts continue to influence the stealth genre. But the most impressive thing of all is that the games still hold up. There's still wonderful stealth games to consume, and the city is a great setting to explore. Now, as has been the case in previous videos about older series, you may need some mods to bring the experience up to modern standards, and in the description you'll find links to the ones I used. You can find all the titles in the series, including the remake, readily available on Steam, and most of them are very cheap. So be it because you love the stealth genre, or you want to explore a bit of gaming history, or both, you will have a lot of fun with the Thief series. So dive into the city and clear it of all its valuables. Just make sure the Hammerites don't catch you.